Chief Executive, Inspector of Schools, Director of the Centre for Special Educational Needs at Westminster College, appointed by the Secretary of State for Education as Director of Children with Complex Learning Difficulties and Disabilities Research Project, and most recently appointed the UK's first professorship in mental health in education. An incredibly wise and experienced gentleman. And all of that, I mean, what I really know about Barry is his genuine kindness and desire to create and leave a legacy to support the social, emotional and mental health of our children, absolutely, but of the adults as we support those children. And he is incredibly generous in sharing his time with us today to talk through all of the work that he's been doing and has done, particularly that in relation to the recovery curriculum. So Barry, if you are there, absolutely great to have you with us this afternoon. And so if you would like to share your screen and get your slides up, and I know that some of those slides and some of these resources, as Richard said, will be made available for colleagues to look at. While Barry is getting his slides onto the screen, you'll also no doubt be aware of his recovery curriculum aspects within his own website, and the most amazing think piece, a 2 A4-sided overview of the theory and the thinking behind recovery curriculum. We're hoping that many of you will have had a chance to read that, but if not, you may well want to look at that as a follow-up to today's session. It's really very, very valuable. This way. So over to you, Barry, and thank you guys for being patient while we were sorting out.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Sharon, for those kind words of introduction. I've already scanned across some of the names, and some of you I know from various and previous lives, and so it's good to know that you are all out there. It's nice to have these opportunities. Not normally the way that any of us would choose to present or interact, but it is what it is, and it's just good to have these CPD opportunities. So thanks to Engage in their future and to NAS for jointly hosting this opportunity this afternoon. I want to share with you then the recovery curriculum, which has probably only been out, if I'm truly honest, less than 2 months. It arose from a conversation with my son Matthew, who is principal at Baxter College, which is 11 to 18 academy in the West Midlands, in Kidderminster. And I was beginning to say to Matthew from very early on in the pandemic, I was worried about how this would impact on the mental health and emotional well-being of our children and young people. And obviously, for those of you who know my background, particularly those with severe, complex learning difficulties, but any child with special needs, any child that is vulnerable. And after a wee bit of taunting, he persuaded me that I ought to write, but I agreed only if he wrote with me, hence this joint piece, which has been a really, I have to say at a personal level, a really wonderful opportunity. Sharon implied it in her introduction, but in fact this is officially my final month of working. I shall retire on the 30th of June. So I'm glad, Rich, that this is being recorded for posterity. The website that you need for follow-up is at the bottom of the slide that is there. Since the think piece was posted, the website, which is being hosted as a philanthropic piece from Evidence for Learning, the app that many of you will know, which is the most fantastic way of assessing children with special educational needs in a way that never in all of my career, which is now just gone over 40 years, have I seen a wraparound approach to assessment. Hallelujah, the days of saying to children, come with me square peg and let me jam you into this round hole, have finally gone, and we have here an assessment approach that enables us to go to that child at their point of learning need, capture their attainment through the video capture facility, and then celebrate for and with the child that achievement. Every child achieves and it should be celebrated. And if we don't know that, it's about having the eyes that enable us to see. And the Evidence for Learning app gives us the lens, helps the eyes to see that attainment and achievement in our children and young people. As of this week, every single day this week, a new podcast is going up on the Recovery Curriculum website. One went up yesterday from Vijita Patel, the principal of Swiss Cottage, which many of you will know in London, particularly looking at compassionate leadership and looking at the centrality of engagement within the curriculum, particularly focusing on the engagement profile as we've redesigned it in response to the Rochford Review, and it's there as an opportunity to try it as the children return to school, to profile their levels of engagement, and it'll be good training for the staff ready for the legislation that once Parliament can get past the pandemic and Brexit, will actually be passing a statutory summative assessment. I've just had notification that another podcast has gone up from Whitfield Aspen School in Dover, which in all my experience is the most inclusive school I've ever come across in the country. And that's looking at primary work, but particularly with children with special needs, with autism, as well as the whole neurotypical primary population. When I was thinking about the experiences that children were having during this pandemic, I began to read around a whole variety of reports and journalistic pieces that were coming out. Remember, we're living in a time that has never been researched. We've never researched this. Justice Health is having to make best judgments about treatment in a way that normally they'd rely heavily on research and evidence-based practice. It is so for us in teaching. Teaching is an evidence-based profession, but we have no sound, systematic evidence around how you deal with children through and post a pandemic. So what I began to realize in my reading, that there was this overarching sense of loss in children. And eventually I came to the 5 losses. There are probably more. There are probably subdivisions of some of these losses, but the 5 losses, I articulated them, would be loss of routine, of structure, of friendship, of opportunity, of freedom. So what do each one of those means for the children? Well, loss is going to have quite an impact on our children. Many of our children have lost opportunities to interact with their social group. There may be a sense of bereavement there. There may be a sense of prolonged mourning. Particularly for our young children or those with significant special needs, they will not have understood why their school had to close. They could actually be feeling quite abandoned. So don't think that they're going to come back to you with arms wide open, socially distanced as I'm sure that's going to be. They may actually come back quite resentful. You made them leave their school, of which they were very fond. You deprived them of seeing their friends every day. And in their eyes, you will see there are questions that you need to answer. There will be anxiety, which I particularly want to unpack, and there will be attachment issues because bonds have been broken. Bereavement, anxiety, attachment are all traumas. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury said exactly those words the weekend before last in one of his addresses to the nation. Many of you will be skilled, particularly those of you in the SEMH sector, in terms of trauma-informed, trauma-led practice. But more than ever, we need to have a repertoire of responses to deal with those things. So, for example, if we're thinking of attachment, we need to think of what that actually means to children. You know, children who are securely attached are better problem solvers, are more curious, achieve better academically, and at an emotional level, they're more self-aware, they're more cooperative, and they self-regulate. Look at all of the benefits there when a child is securely attached. Children are attached to their teachers, particularly in primary and special. settings where you are the main deliverer of education to that child for the majority of a day, they attach to you in an appropriate way, but they attach. And that attachment was abruptly broken. However much you tried to explain, some of your children were beyond that comprehension. I know one school that was telling me they know that families have been driving past the school just to let their children know the school is still there. It's not vanished, it's still there. And one day they can go back to school. And maybe for some, that day is starting. I said I want to touch on anxiety. There is a phenomenon actually that was reported only last week from the Royal College of Psychiatrists based on survey work that they've been doing. So that's the research source for this. But we now have a new phenomenon, colleagues, of lockdown anxiety. Some of our children will return to school gladly. Others will return to school fearfully. Some parents will not let their children return because of their own fears. Some will let them return, but I bet you get 2 or 3 phone calls during the day to ask how he is. So there's going to be those tinges of fear that are going to inform everyone's interaction. Indeed, let's be honest, some of our teachers are going to be fearful about potentially, is the child bringing infection into school? And particularly where we're dealing with children who require intimate care procedures. The PPE and the management of those situations is going to be very, very challenging in schools. I know some colleagues I was talking to the other day were worried about how the children would react to them dressed in face masks and gloves and all of that sort of equipment and not being able to see the face clearly, and particularly where a child has little or no speech. We're relying very much on those non-verbal clues. I just suggest off the top of my head, well, why don't you take a photograph of yourself, make sure it's quite large, laminated for all sorts of hygienic reasons, and pin it to yourself so that even though they can't see your face clearly, they can see your photo badge and they know who it is who is working with them, and they can be reminded of that. But let's think about those anxious children returning to school. And it's not going to be to the classroom that they left. How many head teachers have been on their hands and knees in the last week or so with that hatch tape, blocking off tables, putting the hatch tape down corridors, trying to work out social distancing, etc., etc. So whereas children think they're coming to return to the environment they left, no, they are not. And again, that's going to be crushing for some of our children in terms of their hopes and their aspirations. And you've subdivided their class, and suddenly their best friend, who they wanted to have their playtime with, isn't even in the same class. And in fact, is on a different schedule of breaks and lunch, etc., during the day. So there's a lot of loss again, just in the whole cycle of reconnecting with school and the learning experience. So you're going to have these very anxious children. And we know from research, and so what certainly I'm doing at the moment is using a lot of applied, or what we call translational research, where lessons we know, for example, to do with anxiety or trauma or attachment, from sound research base, how does that apply in the current context? And whilst it's not the perfect fit, because it's not been evolved from the ground and the frame of the current experience, it has a significant amount of relevance. We know neuroscientifically that when the child is anxious, then the cortisol levels begin to rise. We know from this piece of research, and even more significantly from some of the seminal research from Professor Demuta Frith around children with autism, that when the cortisol level reaches the surface of the brain, it blocks the memory imprint. So this isn't necessarily that disruptive child in your classroom. This is a child who is sat at the back of your classroom, didn't say boo to a goose, didn't answer any questions, but in fact was rigid with fear and anxiety during your lesson, just because of the busyness of the classroom, or because they were not totally comfortable in returning to school for whatever reason. The anxious child, as the next slide says, the anxious child is not a learning child. You can teach what you thought was the most brilliant lesson, but in fact, if that child was so anxious that their cortisol levels were risen, then in fact, that was not a learning child. I think increasingly, just to put a tailspin on this one, many of you work in situations where the children with autism, we know that the phenomena of pathological demand avoidance is beginning to increase in our school population. And there are those that say, no, it's not there, and those that say, yes, it is, and indeed some authorities that are overusing the diagnosis of pathological demand avoidance. From the recent book I've written on girls and autism with Professor Francesca Happe, Francesca and I have come to a conclusion that A, autism is probably more of a constellation than it is a spectrum, but B, that in fact, those children that get very, very anxious, so the cortisol level is not only at the surface of the brain, where does that cortisol level go then? And I think there is a backwash effect over the brain that in fact is creating in some of our autistic children this profile that we would diagnose as pathological demand avoidance. So the recovery curriculum, to be very clear, is a construct. We toyed with, Matthew and I toyed with using the word concept, but in fact we've gone for construct because construct is part of the word construction. So let me be clear, this is actually a recovery curriculum. It's something for which you go about constructing in a very personalized way based on the aims and values that exist in your school. Let them inform you. There is no document from the DFE to guide you on this. In fact, I'm having weekly conversations with the DFE at the moment, helping them think through some of the challenges that schools are going to be facing. It needs to be built on compassionate leadership. Sorry, there's a slight typo there, I apologize. But compassionate leadership is absolutely crucial at this time. We cannot say enough to our children when they return, it's really good to see you. I've missed your smile. I'm glad to see your smile again. We can't shake hands today, but what system are you going to develop? Is it going to be the wave? Is it going to be nods or some other form of gesture? Let's re-establish the communication code with the children. And at times, colleagues, the most successful work you can do in the current climate will be based on best informed judgments. I'd like to say it would be based on evidence-based practice, but we've never been teaching children who've just returned from a lockdown. What does that look like? But our work around personalization will inform that personalized response. Can you design the teaching so it genuinely touches that child at their point of learning need? There are 5 levers that my son Matthew designed that really are pedagogical levers. So if you think of a lever, we're trying to lever that child who may be a reluctant, an anxious, a timid learner, lever them back so that they achieve again their status as an active participant, not a peripheral participant standing on the sidelines of the dynamics of your learning classroom, watching everybody else be a successful learner, but are at the heart of that classroom and therefore are successful and active learners. And the first lever is about relationships. Reach out and greet. Socially distanced, but reach out and greet. Don't automatically expect that children are going to return to you joyfully. The fear, the anxiety. I was thinking only last week when it was Mental Health Awareness Week, I do hope that this pandemic does not rob our children of hope. Hope is the gift of childhood. Hope is about your dreams and aspirations. We all had dreams and aspirations in our childhood of what we might be. Some of those dreams may have come through, others, no. But it was nice to dream. It was a good feeling to think you would be the space astronaut walking on the moon. And it didn't matter too much that never came to be. It was just part of the flights of fancy of childhood. Those relationships, relationship-based practice has got to be central. Colleagues, at this point in my career and reflecting back, I'm convinced of one thing and one thing only. Teaching is a relationship-based profession. You need to ask yourself, what is it that called you to be a teacher? Because of the 2 organizations that are represented in hosting this afternoon, I would probably want to say, and what is it in your humanity that called you to work with society's most vulnerable children? And don't walk away from that question. Answer it. Because if you can't answer it for yourself, you'll be of no use to the children. Now more than ever, you need to know who you are, what you can offer, what the relationships you can extend to those children, some of whom are going to be in turmoil when they return. Some of those children that were your most fantastic learners before this are going to return to you timid and anxious. Teaching is a relationship-based profession. They can throw at us whatever policy they want from the DfE. They can terrorize us with the latest version of Ofsted, but they cannot take away from us that we are a relationship-based profession. And within our sector of special educational needs, of which I am so proud, there is no country in the world that does special needs provision as well as we do. There are pockets of good practice elsewhere, of course there are. There are pockets maybe of greater innovation than we have. But in terms of that universal principle of every child deserves an education, even when I know some children are excluded, the starting point is you will have an education. You'd only have to cross the water to France to know that that is not true in every developed country. So the second of the levers in this is about community. For those of you that are head teachers, school leaders, it's going to be about rebuilding your community. Your community has been fragmented. Your community was torn apart through no fault of your own. And yes, it's not very pleasant really, is it? You're left picking up the pieces. But actually, you're re-establishing those relationships with people you care about and who care about you, who yearn for your leadership, that compassionate leadership, that kindness and tenderness you can show just by the actions you put into place. So it's about engaging with your community, listening, understanding, growing together. And on this point, can I say, extend that community very much so, and I know it would be fundamental to the practice of many of your schools, parents, to think too about how we explicitly scaffold teaching. This is not about where the child left us. If the child left us on page 76, it's frankly naive to think the child is going to return on page 76. So this is about putting in place strategies, experiences that actually bring that child back to being an efficient and effective learner. Yes, you may want to blend in some of the academic stuff into the day, but to just have a day that mirrors exactly the sort of days you did before the pandemic is denying the lived experience. And as Dylan Williams says, the curriculum should actually be about the lived experience of the child. So the fourth lever in this process, Sharon, is, if we bring that up, is a transparent curriculum. Can we co-construct with our children? What are their experiences? When my son interviewed his student parliament on Zoom the other week and asked them, what do you want from us when you return? And they all wanted some explanation scientifically of what is coronavirus. What has all this been about? They wanted the facts. Some of your children may be traumatized by the fact that maybe an elderly neighbor in the street died. Some of your children may return having lost a relative to COVID-19. So we need to use sound curriculum principles, which are very popular at the moment, of co-construct, co-create, co-produce. Let's go back to some good, high-quality teaching, not trying to drive a curriculum that will not embrace that child as an active learner. And the fifth of the levers is space. How many of you are working with children with autism who know this is absolutely so? You'll get them back into the classroom for 15, 20 minutes. They will participate actively for that time. And then you know that get them out on a walk, get them out on some exercise, give them a task to do, something to take down to the head's office and bring something back, whatever it is. Just get that energy, which is going to be quite uncontrolled and unrestrained when they return, and give them opportunity in some space to rediscover their self-esteem, their self-image, and their self-concept. So there are three phases, and you may decide there's more, but let's look at these broad thrusts. There needs to be something for everyone. Nobody, ourselves included, your staff included, have escaped this pandemic unscathed. I was talking to a friend the other day, And his 9-year-old had said to him, he understands about the virus, he understands why he can't go to school, but he wants to see his friends. And all he said was, I want to see my friends so that I can see their faces. Young children or children with any sort of special need may actually think that their friends have vanished. Where are those friends? Will they still like them? Will they still be my friend? Will they still want to play with me in the playground? There's a whole load of stuff going on within the child. For some, there will need to be some very focused recovery work, a more personalized approach. Maybe you're going to have small groups where they're discussing particular issues. It might be that some of them are obsessed by the whole death thing. Look, children will have heard those daily death totals in our country, those big numbers of 38,000 plus whatever. We need to actually address that with our children. And for some, there will be deep recovery. This isn't going to be a 2 or 3 week intervention, colleagues. For some, the whole of your next academic year will be about deep recovery for some children. They lost their structure. Children that you've worked with for years to establish structure, particularly those with autism, using the teach approach or whatever, that's just gone. And you need to reestablish all of that. And it's about reestablishing the trust. I'm sorry, through no fault of your own, you did have to abandon your children. You did have to tell them not to come to school anymore. And that has to be worked through. Next slide. And I'm suggesting here you may want to use engagement as a starting point, because engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation. And that's about reestablishing this child as a learner. I've given you the reference there for the Engagement for Learning website. In the last couple of weeks with my colleague Bev Cobill, we've made sure we've rewritten all of the engagement profile, engagement scale, so it aligns with the Rochford requirements. So again, it'll be good CPD in preparing your staff to fulfill those statutory requirements once they're in legislation. So do have a look at the engagement profile as a starting point. And there are some free resources. This is from Books Beyond Words. So this is a completely wordless book. It's downloadable, Beating the Virus. Some of you will think, well, our children are at higher levels of literacy. This is not about literacy. This is about emotional release. When emotion is released in the brain, it is released from the amygdala, which is kind of at the back of your skull. The emotion then transverses the brain. If you put in a reading activity, whether graphically or phonetically, that decoding and encoding process in the frontal cortex will block the emotional release coming from the amygdala. This is about letting that emotion out. You can do literacy another time in another lesson. And please have a look at the bereavement box. This is 60 cards from Tina Ray, beautifully researched, Nurture UK, which I know Sharon also has a very high opinion of in terms of the quality of resources. Do have a look at this. The next one. This I'm particularly promoting because this is a transition toolkit. If you've got year 6 children about to go into year 7, they've had no visits to high schools or wherever the next special educational placement may be, these cards, 60 of them again, are beautifully laminated. Well, we like laminated, don't we, colleagues? And for all sorts of hygienic reasons, more than ever, these cards are wipeable. So, you know, they can be used. And I think because, again, they've come out of the Nurture UK stable, they're built on sound emotional well-being principles. And if you had to give the children something, please think of using these. I know some of you'd say, well, we'd like to explore a range of resources. Well, I'm sorry, tough. You haven't got time. Those children's clock is ticking. If you don't do something proactive with them, they're going to be ill prepared for that secondary transfer. They're going to fall flat on their faces. And you know, for some of the children you're representing, they'll go out of school very quickly, maybe never to return to the education system. That's too high a price to pay. We've now got mental health leads in lots of schools. There's been the mental health lead training, mental health first aid training. Tina Ray has now put together this book on the Wellbeing Toolkit for Mental Health Leads. Again, at this time, I just think well-being has to go central in the curriculum alongside literacy and numeracy. And let's keep it there. Let's keep it there. This has given us a lever we never thought we would have. More than ever, the government is willing to talk about mental health in very constructive ways. Let's maximize on that. The DFE on the 7th of July will be hosting their Relationships and Health Sex Education Conference for SCND sector, and I'm actually giving the keynote to that conference for the DFE. Next slide, Sharon. Simply, colleagues, how do you keep your children and young people emotionally strong? And the picture I've used on this slide is one of exercise, and I'm being deliberate. Exercise is about that endorphin release, the positivity that for the fearful and anxious child returning to your school, to your classroom, let's get the brain into a place where it is receptive to be interactive. I didn't even say learn, just to be interactive. Start to use games and activities that rely on imitation. Imitation appeals to the mirror neurons in the brain. They're copying, they're responding to modeling. Build new neural pathways. It could be that some of the existing neural pathways through which your children are learning could be blocked by trauma. So start some new learning that reinvigorates brain activity. I can talk about that more, but if you go to my website, you'll find some papers on that are relevant. Colleagues, if I analyze the mental health literature, fundamentally it comes down to two things. What makes us happy? What makes us sad? And it's about knowing that when we're sad, how we use what makes us happy to intervene. So here's in the next slide, a practical suggestion. Look at some of the mental health resources that are being put out by Butterfly Print. In the next slide, I'll show you the 4 emotional well-being journals that they use. Great activities. This company has lifted all of its postage costs. You can now buy them singly. You might be having your children back for short periods of time, and then you're going to send them on a 6-week summer holiday. Well, some children will think they've just had an extended summer holiday. They won't understand they're going to get another one as well. And how much of the stuff you've sent home has actually been about emotional well-being? Could have been about sensory learning for some of you, or literacy or numeracy, but these will address that emotional well-being. Not always it should have to do it in a written form, but the very seed of the idea in some of these journals. Yes, they're in key stages. I just tend to buy the set because the ideas are just fantastic within them. Next slide. Going back to my point about happiness, this is a happiness box. Colleagues, I'll confess, it's nothing more than a glorified shoebox. So go forth, get shoeboxes, and your first art lesson is then planned because the children will decorate the shoebox. And then put in that shoebox, let the child put in what they want to put in. I was saying to Sharon, actually, suddenly, this could become a rough screening instrument, you know, because what the child chooses to put in could tell you something about their emotional state. What about that year 6 boy who's always been quite upfront, fairly confident, and suddenly he wants to put a piece of soft material in that happiness box. So when you say to the children, go and have 5 minutes for your happiness box, he's slyly putting in that material into his pocket and he rubs it furiously while we're seeing him to play with something else. In fact, what's that telling you about his emotional state? What feedback sensorially is he getting from rubbing that material? So you can design these in a very personalized way. So what my colleague Bev Coble and I have done, Bev's done a very good sort of Blue Peter step-by-step, here's one I made earlier, type happiness box. And I've written from the literature the evidence-based underpinning as to why happiness boxes would be useful. No cost, low cost. In our local primary school, Chair of Governors, I shared this idea with her, 180 primary children in my village are returning to a shoebox. And whether they're going to be in school or whether they're still home learning, every child is going to have a happiness box ready to bring back to school with them. And as the Royal College of Psychiatrists said, we need to now have interventions around emotional well-being equivalent to what we have in literacy and numeracy. Colleagues, we're knee-deep in literacy and numeracy. Let's have something now that we can use to help the child self-regulate, to restore their emotional well-being, and consequently reignite their learning pathways. In the next slide, it's just another example of a happiness box. And again, you can get the reference there. Kindness. Last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, and the Mental Health Foundation produced this brilliant report on the research base for kindness. And kindness is closely related to compassion, which I've already mentioned. We're going to need multiple acts of kindness to each other as staff and towards our children. Kindness needs to be at the heart of everything we do in our schools. Next slide. As the Maoris say, I'm going to attempt to read the Maori, if kindness is shown, then kindness is what you shall receive. I hope that's your experience in the coming weeks, colleagues. I wish you every success in what is going to be one of the most challenging times in your teaching career. But this is about your humanity, about your relationships, and teaching is a relationship-based profession. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Barry. Absolutely fantastic. And just to reflect on this time when things happen that we don't predict, and the need for the adults to be as steady as they possibly can through the adversity, so that they can then reach out to be emotionally available and present for our children, our families, as they rejoin and reconnect and increase the sizes of our bubbles in our classes, as it were. And I think, Barry, what you always do is create that incredible emotional containment of a psychological safety. And you've modelled for us, when things go wrong and go down, just take a deep breath and steadily unpick, and we will solve the problem together with a group of very kind, patient, willing folk who want to make it happen. So thank you for your absolutely wise words. Thank you for modelling exactly who you are, how you are for us. Are there any questions, comments? What we're clearly seeing is the huge gratitude from everybody that's joining us today for everything that you've shared so far, Barry. So thank you for that. Sue, I'm not too sure. Did you pick up any questions through that, or any other comments that we want to pose to Barry before we then move on with my section?
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts, a couple of considerations, and a question. Well, the first question, Barry, I'm hoping it's going to be really easy. What's the name of the school in Dover that you're referring to?
Called Whitfield Aspen.
Okay,
and yeah.
Okay, I know Claire has made a few comments. In relation to sleep disorders, there's been a higher incidence of sleep disorders, some limited to anxiety, and she was just stating the fact that we need to be aware of that in terms of factors in relation to readiness to learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
A focus, I think you started to touch on it, Sharon, was about recovery for staff. And I think there's an agreement that what we do for children, we must do for staff. Okay, it might be slightly different, but the level of the same input has to be given to our staff. And Dave Duncan from Rosendale, is there a danger that the relaxation in legislation around EHCPs will lead to a return to square pegs in round holes? Could this lead to local authorities supporting more pupils at home and reducing reliance on our non-maintained and independent SEND sector? I'm not sure whether, Barry, you feel able to answer that, but I'm fairly sure that maybe Claire or Sharon or Rich might be able to pick up. No.
Well, the first, remind ourselves that when the Rochford Review legislation goes through, EHCPs actually take on a new status again and become the curriculum driver, not just the kind of administrative record of a child's EHCP itself. Those targets will become a curriculum dynamic. And I think whilst there is a relaxation and there are worries about some of the resources that might be allocated to children, I think the opportunist teacher will see it as a chance to really put through some high quality personalized learning that addresses the child where they're at now. You may decide some of those targets in the EHCP are not relevant as that child returns, because they've returned to you as a different child. Well, frankly, you write that down, you have a quick meeting with the head and one or two others and write the amendments and stuff what it used to say. Just get on in there. It's the children you're paid to serve. The curriculum is the servant of the child. It is not its master.
I think that answers that eloquently. And then there was just a bit of an endorsement for the Books Beyond Words and the Butterfly bits and bobs. Yeah. Absolutely. They're saying that most people are saying that these are excellent resources. And finally, Barry, there was a comment about, thank you so much. It's going to help us plan. if we haven't already. We've got lots of resources. Thank you so much for giving us that intelligent insight. And a final one came from Brendan, who said, enjoy your retirement. When it finally comes.
I've just been asked to have the government seen the recovery curriculum, the Department for Education have it. And let's just say there are conversations that we have, not to implement it, why should they? But if you like, they've accepted the ethos and some of the points made, and the very fact that they've invited me to their conference on the 7th of July, they know we've got challenges and they don't want to be rigid in what they ask you to do, because that would not help you be responsive to where your children are at.
Thank you, Barry.
Lovely, thank you.